Hello, everyone. Good morning, dear viewers, fellow colleagues, friends, undergraduate students, curious people. I'm Manuela Oliveira, and with Marcos Wiedemann, we run the research group, GSIL, and we are very happy to have Mr. Hoffmann for this conference to kick off the event. Well, here's only some information about him. Thomas Hoffmann is professor and chair of English language and linguistics at the Catholic University, Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. His main, thank you, I tried really hard. His main research interests are linked to cognitive linguistics, language variation and change, usage-based construction grammar, and multimodal communication. He has published widely in international journals such as Cognitive Linguistics, English Worldwide, and Corpus Linguistics, amongst many other relevant works. And some of his most recent publications are Construction Grammar, The Structure of English, 2022, Co-Pilots for Linguistics, 2023, and finally, 2024, A Construction Grammar of the English Language. Currently, he's working on psychological as well as cognitive aspects of linguistic creativity. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to invite Professor Thomas Hoffmann. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Manuela and Marcos, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share with you some of my most recent work. Okay, I'm just gonna start the presentation. That should be there any second. So today I'll be giving you a short introduction to Casa, which is a constructionist approach to syntactic analysis. It's, as the subtitle says, a cognitive pedagogical model of sentence analysis that I've developed together with my colleague and friend Thomas Herbst from the University of Erlangen. Even though the accompanying book is out now with Benjamin's, it's still work in progress, and we will see that there are many issues that still pop up even after publication. So this was never intended as something that we just present and then it's over, but it's a model that keeps developing. The motivation for our book and for the Casa approach is threefold. So it's got a pedagogical motivation. We wanted construction grammar to be presented in a way so that undergraduates can easily be introduced to it. And at the same time, we wanted it to be compatible with established descriptions of English grammar, because that is what is still used in many parts of the world with respect to English language and linguistics teaching. So there had to be an opportunity of connecting these things. From a theoretical point of view, we're aiming for a cognitively plausible model. And as an applied angle, it should show students and future teachers the value of constructionist analyses, and hopefully therefore also make greater inroads into language teaching. With respect to where we're coming from, and I assume that many of you are familiar with construction grammar, it is a largely Goldbergian usage-based approach. We subscribe to the idea that language is symbolic, that constructions, pairings of form and meaning of various schematicity and granularity make up the knowledge of language. And we wanted to show how these meaningful units, how the constructions can be used to create sentences. Or utterances, which we call constructs, the combination of constructions. We incorporate ideas of overlap from Dubrovsk and Leven, who looked into first language acquisition and described the processes by which children build up their repertoire of constructions. And we draw heavily on conceptual blending as a domain general cognitive approach to the combination of construction. That's going to be another very important theoretical point, and one that I've just sort of developed further together with Mark Turner in a forthcoming element in cognitive linguistics. That's under production, should come out later this year or at the start of next year. So what were the challenges when we first wanted to embark on this journey? Well, anyone who has looked at construction grammar knows that there is no single standard format for the description of constructions. If you look at Adele Goldberg's work and you look at how construction is represented, it's completely different from what the fluid construction grammar people like Remy van Tripp, Paul van Eke or Katrin Boyles are doing. And if you look into work by Laura Michaelis or Ivan Sark and Paul Kay, who work with sign-based construction grammar, again, the format is going to be completely different. Also, the terminology differs widely. I mean, the core beliefs, the core tenets of construction grammar are shared. Language is a symbolic communication system. Constructions are at the heart of it. It's constructions all the way, from the morphological level over idioms, and I will show you a couple of examples up to syntactic structures. But which terminology is used, for example, for syntactic functions, objects, obliques, that is not standardized. So we had to decide on something. We made decisions. Like any decisions, some of these might be debatable, but we opted for an approach which is, as we said, makes it easy to link to traditional grammar and traditional grammar teaching. And in the book itself, in chapter 2, a very short overview, there we provide the basic descriptive uses of standard grammatical terminology, from subject over object to semantic roles and so on, to give students an idea of what people have already used. And later in the book, we'll link the constructionist approach to these traditional labels. There is also the challenge, and that is one that cannot be overcome by any kind of book of this scope, and that is that the Constructicon, our network of constructions, Holger Dissel has recently in 2019 published a very important book on this, that this is an individual property, right? So we do assume that across individuals, we share many constructions and our networks are going to be similar. But if we subscribe to a usage-based perspective, your input is going to be slightly different from mine. And that means that some constructions are more deeply entrenched in your mind than they are in mine, and the other way around. And as we will see, sometimes people can use different constructions to get to the same construct. Just as an example, if you think of a glass of wine, right, as a string, a glass of wine. Now, traditionally, you would analyze this as glass being the head of a noun phrase, of wine being a post modifier. From a usage-based perspective, it's very well possible, and if you look at corpora, that a glass of wine, a glass of beer, a glass of soda, is such a chunk that it can become automatized. And then you have a glass of plus a slot for the liquid, right? And at the same time, you know, with respect to individuals, if you are someone who really likes wine and you have a glass of wine regularly, then just like good morning or howdy or whatever, you know, you might chunk this to a glass of wine. I'm going to have a glass of wine. So some speakers might have the whole chunk, others might have a glass of, and maybe for other people it is possible that they just use a standard noun phrase construction and combine them into the same construct. The point being that what looks like, what is the same construct with respect to how we can look at it once it's produced, a glass of wine, lends itself to different constructional analyses. And so developing a framework that is supposed to analyze authentic sentences, utterances, constructs, will every so often have to take into account, or at least mention the fact that there might be alternative ways of getting to the same result. As a final footnote, and I know I digress quite a lot, from a language perspective point of view and from an evolutionary point of view, this, however, is quite beneficial. right? So we don't have to share 100% of our constructicon. We can process constructs using the constructions we have, even if they are slightly different from what the speaker used to create them. A final challenge in all of this, as you will see, is the complexity of authentic utterances. If you look at the literature, the syntactic literature of the last, I don't know, 70 years, 80 years, it's quite clear, and for obvious reasons, that the example sentences in these books are very simple. So in the generative literature, if you read Chomsky from 1955 down to most recently, very often he talks about sentences like, there is a man in a garden, a man is in the garden, because that's a theoretically interesting sentence to his enterprise. Construction grammar, conversely, she sneezed the napkin off the table is an example that Adele Goldberg at one point discussed, and many people have also looked at this. It's a nice example that illustrates the constructional nature of language, because sneeze is an intransitive verb. It cannot have the caused motion meaning like put. You put the napkin on the table or whatever. Still in she sneezed the napkin off the table, we get exactly this caused motion meaning. So the napkin is caused to be blown off the table. So you can see there are pet constructions, pet utterances that any kind of linguistic theory looks at. But language in the wild, as Mark Turner sometimes calls it, is much more difficult. So this is an attested sentence. Ybburg, I think it's a Dutch city, is going to be crisscrossed by canals, and when completed, it will have 43 bridges, all different. And now when you think about what are all the constructions that are used to create this construct, you can appreciate the complexity of it all. In the book, and I will go through this, I will explain it, I just want you to show what we ended up with. So here we break up the sentence on 2 pages. Ybburg is going to be crisscrossed by canals, and that's a coordination construction. So on the second line, hopefully in purple, you see a box to the left that says coordination construction, and the coordination construction, in this case, a synthetic one where and is used, has a coordinate T1 and several others, and then the final one, in this case, is going to be crisscrossed by canals, is one of these coordinates. From the order, which again we will go into later in the talk, you can see that we start on the top. Dex is declarative sentence, so the sentence level constructions come first. Coordination goes wherever something is coordinated. In this case, it's a predicate, is going to be crisscrossed by canals and something else. We got tense in green, in teal, so present tense going to, and passive is also part of this. And then we've got a passive monotransitive construction, because canals crisscross Ybburg would be the active version, and we believe that passives, we're following Remy von Tripp here, have their independent constructional template, and then the level of phrases. So sort of starting with the words, we put them into phrases at the bottom, then these are put into the argument structure constructions, then tense, modality, passive, negation, coordination wherever it fits, and at the top level, we have the sentence level, the utterance level constructions. The motivation for all of these and the details of this are all in the book. I will touch upon some of the issues, but it's of course beyond the scope of a single talk to go into all of the details of the analysis. But what this hopefully shows is that we're able, and if we go to the next slide, when completed, it will have all, it will have 43 bridges, all different. We can also cover this. Now, in 2018, we published the first attempt at Casa, and if you compare the 2 representations, they're completely different. We struggled a long time with how to list the constructions and also have them overlap. So that, for example, as a simple case, the pronoun it here fills the subject slot of the argument structure construction, and it is the subject of the clausal construction. And as you see, there is overlap. We did not go for a most economical representation where you only have something like the subject once, because as you will know, English is not a pro-drop language, to use a genitive metaphor. But of course, if you have infinite clauses, to eat something is important, right? Normally, you eat something, that's a monotransitive argument structure construction, and it has a subject. But if you use the same argument structure construction in a non-finite context, in a non-finite constructional context, the subject is not expressed, but normally sort of interpretable from context or cotext. So, as I said, just a very short, brief illustration of what it looks like. The main question is, how do constructions combine into constructs, into complex utterances and sentences? Casa, constructionist approach to syntactic analysis, is what we offer as a model. Constructicon.de is currently also where we provide an overview of the constructions we've covered so far. It's work in progress, and we hope to add more constructions there as we go along. So you can check it out already. However, there's also already a first list of constructions. Okay. One thing that's important, Holger Dissel has published this wonderful book on the constructional network. We do assume that constructions are stored in a network. That, I think, is something that most construction grammarians would agree these days. Of course, they will cluster, so something like idioms will cluster together, argument structure constructions cluster together, but they will be linked to each other. And there are connections through all of these. Now, just very briefly, sort of going through the levels, one thing that you already have to deal with is, of course, that word forms of single words. If you want to think about words as constructions, kick, for example, can appear as the past tense, but strikers are there to get kicked, just as defenders are there to kick them, so a to infinitive, and it's got kicking and kicks and so on. So these are the specific word forms. We'll assume that these are stored. And then whether a lexeme exists or whether it's a linguist's sort of way of capturing the similarity, the fact that these are going to be tied closely in the network because their meaning is the same and they share a lot in their form, is an open question, but kick as a lexeme is a useful way of capturing this. Now, in the book, we only point to this, but of course, there's also great work on constructional semantics from a frame semantic point of view. So if you think about kick, you can go to FrameNet, and you will see down here, it's part of the cause harm frame, where the definition is the words in this frame describe situations in which an agent or a cause injures a victim. The body part of the victim, which is most likely directly affected, may also be mentioned in place of the victim. In such cases, the victim is often indicated as a genitive modifier of the body part, and so on. So it's the cause harm frame, and it's an agent that strikes or propels forcibly with a foot at the body part of the victim. That's one way of capturing the semantics here. And then you get things like the dancers kicked him. So you see dancers fills the agent slot, and him is the victim. And this is how you can link this to the past tense frame. You would assume that the past tense is a construction that combines, and with regular verbs, it's easy to see how this is done. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with that. Okay, so while we're talking about words and word classes, we heavily draw on insights from Ron Lengecker and cognitive grammar. I think it's fair to say that sometimes in construction grammar, we get a bit sort of lost in our construction, so to speak. Because there are slogans like constructions all the way down, knowledge of language is the knowledge of constructions. And that is true. There is a very important part of this. But of course, as a cognitive linguistic theory, we always also say that domain general principles play a role, like analogy, schematization, categorization, and so on, and embodiment, since we're talking about work classes. And these are important processes that influence the constructicon as well, and that crucially influence how we should think of the meaning pole of construction. So in classic sort of school grammars, sometimes a noun is described as a person, place, or thing, and a verb is called an action, a process, or an event. Now, if you've ever done language teaching or any kind of grammar, you will know that this is criticized because of examples like for. Sorry, the streaming deck sort of slightly rearranges the formatting, but I think you'll still be able to see it. So you get the bomb disposal unit destroyed the bomb with a controlled explosion. Authentic example from FrameNet. And of course, it's clear here that this is an action, right? It happens in the past. It's definitely something that unfolds over time. So there, the semantic definition of verb would fit well. However, there is also nominal corresponding utterance. Which goes the bomb disposal unit's destruction of the bomb with a controlled explosion, which seems to describe the same event, right? So this is sometimes used as saying you cannot use a purely semantic definition for work classes. That, of course, is true to a certain degree, but there is, of course, also a difference between destroyed and destruction. And Ron Langecker, and as we said, we draw heavily on the semantics of work classes on his work, pointed out that on the one hand, destroyed, there you construe this event as unfolding over time, whereas in destruction, you treat it like a bounded unit. You do not care so much about how the individual events happen, but you treat it as one big thing that you can grasp, to use that metaphor. And so from a cognitive grammar perspective, destruction is conceived of as a thing. It treats this event and looks at it, and that's a very important term, construal, right? So a matter of perspective, either as sort of the whole thing, the destruction, and then you worry about whatever sort of effect that had, or if you zoom in on the process, if you have like a mental little video that goes on, then you can see that they destroyed, that unfolded over time. There was a process as indicated by this graph to the right. So there is a semantic difference, and that's going to be part of the meaning of work classes, of abstract nouns and verbs as a work class construction. Though some people even argue it's not clear whether we need these at all or whether it's just lower level schemas. So I would always say that from a construction grammar perspective, we need to think about work classes as prototypes. That's not new. Work grammar, Hudson and others have said this before. So you've got prototypical categories like pen, milk, and love. So pen is a countable noun. A pen, the pen, two pens. Milk is a classically construed mass noun. So you can say the milk, but not a milk or one milk, unless you construe it in a different way. And love is, of course, an abstract concept and not something that you can hold like a pen. So it's not like an object, a physical one. You've got morphosyntactic features. So something that's construed as a verb is also used with the morphosyntactic features of third person singular s, past tense morpheme, ed, and so on. And distribution and analysis, because if you construe something as a noun, you put it into the construction, their destruction of Rome. If you use it as a verb, they destroyed Rome, so a different type of pronominal use, as well as the linking to Rome. But, and that's important, and Lange has pointed this out, there are also semantic properties. So it's not exclusively one of these. All of these as a prototypical category make up a word class. This is an overview of from my 2022 book, where I summarize sort of how cognitive linguistics sees the semantics of these word classes. So nouns are things in a cognitive linguistic point of view, so a conceptualization as a bounded unit, whereas verbs are processual relationships, adjectives are non-processual relationships, and so on. So this is something that we also draw on the insights from cognitive grammar. Okay, moving on. Once we get beyond words, well, what's a word? That's a talk in itself. But if we go beyond things which are just simplex, we know that there are idioms, consisting of several parts, like the jig is up. That's a full idiom. You cannot say normally because, well, we're going to get to that. We can't say the jigs are up or something like that. The jig is up is a chunk. It means the game is up. And there we got a fixed phonology. Though, however, B's here in capital letters because it's a lexeme, you can say the jig was up, the jig will be up. So there is at least some internal flexibility. Now, idioms are a very important part of construction grammar because they moved us along the lexicon syntax climb. Everyone agrees that words, I think every syntactic theory, every linguistic theory agrees that words are symbols, arbitrary pairings of form and meanings mostly. And idioms were the next step up towards this lexicon syntax climb. Even within idioms, there's a difference and a gradient. So he kicked the bucket and she spilled the beans. First one means someone died. The second one means someone told a secret, divulged some information. But whereas you have passive construal for the beans were spilled, you cannot have the bucket was kicked. That's got something to do with how we associate the meaning with parts, and that in she spilled the beans, as Croft and Cruz point out, the beans has a non-conventional meaning. Sorry, just coming back from a cold. So the beans has a meaning that's specific to this idiom, and it means a secret or whatever. And the bucket doesn't have an independent meaning in kick the bucket, but kick the bucket as a whole gets the meaning of die. So it's not so easy to tear it apart. Okay, so one way of looking at this is that spill the beans has the beans as an element with a 3 here, and that refers to the information on the semantic level. You needn't worry about any of the other representation. That's from my 2022 book. And kick the bucket, as I said, kick the bucket as a whole, gets a bracket, gets a number. You click on the number like on a link, and then you get to die. So this whole thing means die, but not bucket on its own. When I wrote the 2022 book, I still had a fairly rigid idea of constructions, to be honest. Now, the past couple of years, I'm more and more convinced that construction should be seen as something that's really fixed, but as dynamic. So even something like kick the bucket is flexible to a certain degree. We can see a tendency that it's fairly fixed, but you can have things like he kicked the proverbial bucket, right? Where you can squeeze in proverbial between the and bucket, and that looks like a modifier. And you can do this because the bucket, of course, also matches the constraint, the construction of an NP, and normally a noun phrase in English can have a modifier. But the interesting bit about the proverbial is that it doesn't modify bucket, right? It doesn't mean that there is anything of an object that it relates to, but it's like an adverbial of the entire verb phrase. It means kick the bucket, metaphorically speaking. So the scope is different. Now, these don't occur very often, but what they show is that there is much more flexibility, that we shouldn't think of constructions just as these tight, squeezed, inflexible entities. Remy van Tripp is working on a book he calls this tensorgrade, and he also says that constructions can bend. Very much looking forward to what he has to say on this. And I think that's a very interesting research direction that we're going in, because one thing that the large language models, that's not the point of the talk, but one thing that they've shown is that humans are not computers. Okay, we are not just next token predictors. The large language models are really great and they do an awful lot, but they also differ in important ways from how humans use, learn, acquire, and store and process language. So that's definitely something that's going to further our understanding of the mental storage of constructions. Okay, so as an illustration from Casa now, if you look at the early bird catches the worm, of course, we know that's another idiom. If you do something, do it right away, don't leave it for later, that kind of thing. And you would assume, again, that this is fairly inflexible. But when you look at similar structures, you get the early bird gets the worm, catches the worm, the early bird gets the urn, obviously a pun, and gives you the complete opposite meaning. And then later on also, the early beliefs determine the trajectory, the early bird eats the worm, and so on. So there is, again, this flexibility to it. How do we cover this in Casa? This is from the website. So clearly you need a construction for this because it's got an idiosyncratic meaning. Meaning paraphrases are always difficult. We'll do our best to be consistent there. An effector acts early enough to gain advantage over others. Effector is our cover term for agent and cause. So you have a potential subject here as the effector, and that can be the early bird, the early whatever. And then if you look at the corpora, you can see that probably gets and catches are most entrenched in this construction, but you can also have other instances like eats. And here the worm is the affected prototypical instantiation. But as we've seen, the urn can also be used creatively. What this already shows is that there is a difference between constructions, something that we store in the long-term memory, and which we then turn into a construct, something that is produced in language use, because constructs are created in the working memory, and there the flexibility comes into play, and you can also add new stuff and be creative. Okay, so we moved from words as constructions to idioms as constructions. All of this is uncontroversial, I think, in most theories of language. But one of the most important areas of construction grammar where it was developed are argument structure constructions, abstract schematic constructions that encode basic human scenes, as Adele says. So this is a quote from a Essential 1995 book. The central senses of argument structure constructions have been argued to be associated with humanly relevant scenes, someone transferring something to someone, something causing something to move or to change state, someone experiencing something, and so on. And you know the list. There are resultative constructions, ditransitive constructions, transitive construction. All of these have been postulated in the literature. Now, as basic human events, what's important, and this is a static representation of this, so it's only an approximation, but you've got to think about that. We've got agents, patients as something that we observe. Location is something that we keep track of and derive from this as time. And then you get basic event types like force dynamic one, an effector, exerting force onto an affected. So if you eat an apple, the apple is affected. If you break a vase, clearly, you know, you are the affector. The force comes from you, and the mug or cup is, or vase or whatever you break is affected. And then if we think about this, a classic example is the resultative construction. Firefighters cut the man free. There is a force dynamic relationship between firefighters and something that they cut. But of course, could he shriek himself unconscious? He'd often drunk himself silly. what these illustrate is that the verb normally wouldn't be used in this resultative meaning. Cut normally is transitive, a cutter cuts something, shriek is an intransitive verb, you shriek, and drink normally a transitive verb, a drinker drinks a drink. So you can see that the resultative meaning doesn't come from the verbs, as Goldberg argues. And this is why we get schematic slots. She, for example, used subject, verb, object, and oblique, and that's an agent causes a patient to become result goal by being. If we think about this in terms of the force dynamics, the effect of the agent has the force exerting on the patient, which then becomes something else. This is our representation in the book. We call this the course change resultative construction. That's a point I will return to later on, because again, there's a theoretically interesting question hiding behind this template. We say that with respect to roles, there's a subject, a verb, an object, and an attribute. That's a syntactic function that we define in the book. And this is where we, I think, differ from most construction grammar approaches so far. We also list all of the realizations. So this can be a noun phrase, a hit or miss affair, or it can be an adjective phrase, purple. We use color coding so that if you open any page of the book, you're able to say, oh, the object is the affected attribute. So conversation and it, both in purple, these are supposed to be the affected attribute. Okay, transitive construction, she kissed him, he opened the window, we've got an affecter and an affected, and the affected does something to an affected. That's sort of summarizing as a shorthand expression of the force dynamic that's going on. If you look at Bill Croft's 2012 book, Verbs, he goes much more into the force dynamic nature, how events unfold over time. So again, this should be seen as a shorthand for the complex force dynamic relationships that go on. Okay, in transitive motion construction, an undergoer moves somewhere. Then we've got subject attribute construction. So an attributee is described, identified, or located by an attribute. So subject slot, verb slot, and then this attribute, and the attribute can be realized by noun phrase, adjective phrase, prepositional phrase, and that clause. So Nancy Pelosi is the most powerful Democrat in the House of Representatives. The lighthouse is superb. She lives in the Netherlands, and the problem is that both countries are playing a dangerous game. Now, you will already notice that the lighthouse is superb, obviously attributes a property to the lighthouse, whereas in she lives in the Netherlands provides a location for her. And now the question is, do you then say, because of the difference in semantics, you turn these into two constructions? Or do you say, well, the fact that my attribute, the attributee here, is an adjective phrase gives me the property meaning, and the fact that it's a prepositional phrase already gives me the locational meaning. So can't I just subsume this under the subject attribute construction? We sort of always tend towards an interpretation where we postulate fewer constructions and let individual components contribute these meaning differences. Below, I will quickly then discuss the difference between the ditransitives and how these are represented, because it raises an interesting question about the mental status of constructions. And as a footnote, who's to say that different people do not store this in different ways? Okay, this is not so important. Here we've got the ditransitive construction just because it's a classic. She gave him a quick hug and he told me the same thing. Subject, verb, two objects. First object is the recipient and the second object the affected. Okay, caused motion, which we had earlier. Now, what's important is the fact that we cannot let the argument structure constructions alone sort of decide what works. Because, of course, the idea is that you can use intransitive verbs in, for example, the resultative, firefighters cut the man free. and cut doesn't have this resultative meaning, so it's the argument structure that coerces, that gives you, that adds this. But it turns out that the verb semantics is also important as to the compatibility. So you look at, they smeared paint on the wall. Paint is the liquid, wall is the target, you get the cause motion construction. And you can also say they sprayed paint on the wall. Again, there's a liquid paint and you get a target. But when it comes to intransitive motion, whether the liquid can sort of be construed as traveling independently, paint sprayed on the wall is fine, but paint smeared on the wall suddenly is not. So you get two verbs which are similar, also with respect to what Adele calls coverage, which you would probably also get if you looked at semantic vector space models, you know, computational ways of looking which distributions words have, and smear and spray, clearly similar in many respects. But, and that's, Iwata pointed this out, you cannot say paint smeared on the wall because of the construal of the verb semantics. So, whereas in spray, normally you have a can, right? So the liquid moves independently of what you do. You press a button and then the liquid moves independently. And then you, as a human, you can zoom in on this and say, paint sprayed onto the wall. Zoom in on this part of the event. With smearing, you do it with your hands and the paint is on your hands. And so the paint never leaves your hands until it's on the wall. There is no independent place in between. So the hands are always there, which is why the paint isn't independent, which makes this difficult to produce, to understand. Paint smeared on the wall. So the verb semantics, even though it's similar here and it's got similar roles, similar participants, semantic roles, the frame semantic interpretation, the construal of it, also plays a role in how we combine argument structure constructions and verbs. And then there's also something verb class specific, and this is something which, or we call item-based in our approach, collo profiles of constructions. If you say she passed him the salt, you get successful transfer. She threw him the ball, you get successful, well, you get transfer via ballistic motion. Pass has no ballistic motion, right? You don't assume that someone chucks you the salt. And in throw or kick, you've got this ballistic motion on top of this. And then you get ditransitive, like she denied him the answer, which is in essence, he didn't get it, right? So negative transfer. And that's again a specific meaning. You denied him the answer, you refused him the answer. There are different types, but it seems like you need, as Croft says, verb-specific argument structure constructions. And if you zoom in even more, you can say she denied him the answer, she refused him the answer, so there are negative ditransitives. But verbs which have a similar meaning, like prevent or disallow, she prevented him the answer, she disallowed him the answer, don't work. So it seems like there are verb-specific preferences. This is from Hoffmann 2017, where I just sort of outline what this looks like. If we use, and again, sorry, it's not ideal online, if we use the Casa representation, we got the ditransitive, we got the meaning, effector makes recipient, receive, and affected. We've got the semantic and syntactic slots, so subject, object one, object two. Subject one, subject is the effector, object one is the recipient, object two is the affected. But we also try to give, and this is very much work in progress because it's a lot of work. This is from the BNC, and there almost 50% of the instances that Thomas Herbst found were give. So the lexeme give. So that's the prototypical verb. From language acquisition, we know that this is important. The next one is tell. And then offer, cost, show, and all the other ones, bring, send, and so on, already have a lower token frequency. But these collo profiles, these item-based components, we believe are part of constructions, and they're important. And ideally, we want to incorporate this into the constructicon as well. Now, I said there's a theoretical point here, and I know that I've already talked for quite a long time. I try to do another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's fine. So if you look at, she gave him a book and she baked him a cake. Answer shouldn't be there, okay? These are instances of the transitive, and we would say, well, all fair and square. but she gave him the book. The book already existed before she gave it to him. She baked him a cake. The cake comes into existence, right? It wasn't there, but it's created by the baking action. It's quite a crucial difference. Now, if you look at 15 and 16, they considered her a great professor, object attribute. She is a great teacher. That's what they considered, what they thought. And then you look at, they made her a professor, where her becomes a professor, her is a professor. We treat this as an instance of the resultative construction. So 15 and 16, classically, 2 constructions. 13 and 14, 1 construction. We would argue, however, I mean, there's no straightforward way of knowing. Some people might have 2, some people might have 1, but the point is, the form in 13 and 14 is subject, verb, object, object. The form in 14 is identical. In 15, we've got subject, verb, object, attribute. In 16, we've got subject, verb, object, attribute. And there is a difference in meaning. We understand this. But in 13 and 14, people so far have said, well, yeah, it's the verb that gives you this difference in meaning. It's still a ditransitive construction. It's the bake and all of those verbs from the coverage cloud that give you the meaning. So the verbal semantics was the thing that gave you the special meaning of creation. In the second one, and they made her a professor, however, of course she becomes a professor, and they considered her a great teacher. That's more like a stative thing, that she already has. There, make is a verb that could contribute this creation aspect, right? The causation. And so the real question is, couldn't we just also subsume this under a single construction and say that the verb meanings give you the resultative? Not that we have a very specific answer. We've got a tendency, and sometimes Thomas Herbst and I don't agree, but you can see that we have to treat all constructions equally, then we have to give similar answers to both of these. Okay, I'm not going to go into the noun phrases influenced by cognitive grammar. With respect to adjectives, just to illustrate this, nice is an adjective and it's a property, right? Something is nice, someone is nice. Now, when we want to unpack constructions, it turned out that at one point it got very overwhelming and difficult to do. So you could say that evening is an instance of the indefinite singular noun phrase construction with an article and the noun. And then you've got the pre-modified noun construction where you can put an adjective, and that's going to have as its property, it's going to be a property of its noun that follows. And then you blend them, they come together, and you get this. Initially, we also tried these boxes within boxes. So adjective noun, that's the premodifier construction, and the larger box would be the noun phrase construction. But in the end, for the most complex sentences, we opted for this as a shortcut. So you have the indefinite singular noun phrase construction here, provides the article and the noun, and then pre-modifier construction adjective is just added here. And 2 things pre-modifier construction tells us: there's a constructional template for this, and also, as you will see in any kind of Casa representation, and I should have mentioned this earlier, constructions are always pairings of form and meaning. Okay, if you just see form, it's an insufficient description. Now, in our Casa analyses of very complex sentences, we tried, but then ended up not putting in the semantic rules. Why did we do that? Because it's very complicated, and Casa representation should always be seen as pointers, as shorthand notations. So even though we only give you the formal part here in order to analyze complex utterances, the constructional name indicates that this has a meaning, that all of these elements contribute meaningfully to the interpretation. So the article here, of course, signals that it's information that we assume the hearer cannot yet identify. It's new information for them. It's got an information structural property. Okay, this is how we treat attributes, then adverbs. As I said, there's tenses and the orders in which they come. It's all in the book. Okay. My screen just gone. Okay. So at the top level, I said we've got sentence level constructions, just quickly going through this. So declarative statements. Ben was tired, Ben made more mistakes. Their meaning is making a statement, like an illocutionary, pragmatic meaning almost. In English, if they're finite, they've got a subject, and this is expressed by capital letters, and a verb, and the T and the M stands for the fact that it's marked or includes information on tense or modality. The falling intonation is also part of the form, and then we give examples. We've got WH, subject interrogatives, yes or no questions, imperatives. As I said, it's all in the book. But the one final thing before I show you a couple of more analysis is, how do all of these things come together, right? We say constructions are pairings of form and meaning in the long-term memory. Constructs, particular utterances, are created in the working memory. The working memory itself is a metaphor for what's going on there. Because, I mean, when you look at the brain and the processing that happens there, there are lots of areas that are sort of activated when we draw on memory information, the default mode network, the executive network, and so on. But what we're saying is basically it's not just what is stored, but what is stored is put together as a metaphor. And we argue that this is done by conceptual blending. Only very infrequently do you use a construction like that's the way the cookie crumbles and you activate it. That's the way the cookie crumbles and there's not an awful lot you change to it. In most cases, like they were able to cut the turtle loose. Oops. Oh, that doesn't go away because the animation is gone. You see that it's a declarative statement construction. You see that there is a resultative construction. There are the word constructions. There is the be able to construction in here. There's a past tense that's expressed in were. There's a subject, obviously. And all of these constructions blend into the output. So conceptual blending, Turner and Fauconnier introduced this, is the idea that you can put together two or more input spaces. And these input spaces can be ideas, they can be music, they can be mathematical equations. And Fauconnier and Turner, the way we think, 2002 is full of these examples. It's got properties of selective projection and emergent meanings. That's something that Mark and I go into the element. And we also discuss alternative ways of combining constructions and argue that conceptual blending as a domain general process is superior because one commitment of construction grammar, of usage-based construction grammar, is that there should be very little domain-specific operations. Symbolic thinking, clearly, you know, form and meaning, that's central to language. But the combination bit, we believe, should not be modeled by unification or constraint satisfaction or merge or however you want to call these language-specific processes that put things together. But use conceptual blending as a domain general principle that has been shown to be at work in all areas of cognition. And as I said, we outline this in the forthcoming book. So what this looks like is that if you have a coordination construction, X or Y, and you then have tea and coffee, in a very simple way, we assume that these blend, overlap, and then you get the meaning tea or coffee. And in each new quarter of the city, if you wanted to disentangle this, there's a quantifier construction, you've got a pre-modifier construction, a post-modifier, and they all blend into this output. And in the construction grids, we sort of disentangle this again and show you the constructions that were part of the input of conceptual blending. Okay. So for the final part, just 3, 4, 5 minutes. In the final chapter, we then bring all of this together and we say, if we analyze a complex utterance, for us, it had turned out that you start with the sentence type constructions at the start, go with modal, tense, and aspect, then have passive, negation, argument structure constructions, adjunct constructions, and phrasal constructions. We do not claim that this is the order in which the mind combines them. There might be many different ways of doing this, and cognitive studies will show which parts of a construction, which constructions might be activated first. But as we show, this is the most convenient way of capturing the component constructions. So I will always love you is a declarative statement construction. It requires a subject because it's finite. So this is I. Will always love you is our predicate. And as part of the predicate, we need a verb that's marked for tense or modality. Will is a modal verb, so that's fine. Will love is separated by always, and we indicate this because we believe in the dynamic nature and that things are not as chunked, inflexible, as I said, by this line here. So something can intervene, but the speaker will know that the construction consists of will plus verb, because a modal verb always requires another verb as its scope. Then you have a transitive construction, which has a subject, a verb, and an object. In these cases realized by noun phrases. These noun phrases are pronouns, I and you, and there's an adjunct, something that is blended into the construction, and that's here always. This is how it looks for I should really drink more water. Again, declarative statement construction. Modal verb, we've got rid of the subject here, but of course modal verbs are finite and always need subject. So that was a question of, do we keep this, do we leave it out? In the end, we left it out, but in the book we discussed that should obviously also is very strongly associated through usage with subjects, because they're not used in non-finite clauses, right? So more strongly associated with subjects than other verbs. Transitive construction again, and here another adverb that intervenes as an adjunct. And finally, summing up, we've got lots of sentences in the book that we analyze. We're doing a lot more. We're thinking about a workbook to illustrate this. Maybe going back one slide. This is a representation, maybe better that one. This is a representation of the constructions that can enter the construct I will always love you. We give you the formal slots and indicate by ranking them below each other that they can blend into each other, over each other. So the pronoun blends into the subject slot of where there's a noun phrase element, and that's going to be the subject of the entire clause. So we're assuming that we give you that. And of course, we're always expecting you to know that this is only the formal part, that by labeling this a construction, everything here is going to have a semantic side as well. Okay, and it's really only after, I'm going to say blood, sweat, and tears, but at least a lot of time that Thomas and I tried many different ways of illustrating how constructions combine, that we decide, well, this links pretty well to descriptive, like structuralist, Quirkian kind of analyses of language by the terms, and at the same time by referring the constructions and a bit of color coding, that should link you to the meaning pole of what we've got here. It's really important, so I'm going to say it again. Just because we've only got the form part here doesn't mean we're not doing construction grammar. By the labels we imply there is meaning, and meaning is very important. So finally, the theoretical point of all of this is utterances are constructs. Constructs are created in the mind, and these are blended constructions. Our analysis, for English at least, is a first attempt at showing how we can use a shorthand to show all of the constructions that are involved in the production of a construct. There are many theoretical formalisms out there. So head-driven phrase structure grammar, base construction grammar, sign-based construction grammar, fluid construction grammar. But whenever you use one of those, I mean, you need a lot of training. They're very complicated. They don't easily transfer to each other. And this is where the pedagogic motivation comes in. Very difficult to teach. Okay. So our Casa approach is something which we hope is more straightforward. and can be used as a common ground denominator between people from different approaches, more formal ones, more usage-based ones, so that we know what we're talking about, which constructional levels we assume in an analysis. There is still that goal to make it compatible with processing models. I mean, that's a very long-term model because, as we said, a long-term goal, it's not easy and not easy to predict because our order doesn't not automatically mean that this is the order in which people activate parts in their mind. And finally, the constructicon that we have, that's still very much under construction, right? As befits a constructional approach to language, and we hope to add more information there and more constructions. Thank you very much for your attention. These are just a couple of selected references. There are way more pieces of work we should have to look at, but that was a short overview of Casa. Thank you.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you so much for your presentation. I guess it's a lot to take in, right, for the Casa motto, with the thorough reading of your book, which is something that we've been doing for so long. I have a comment that I got from messages here. Yes, and I also have a question for you. A comment which is related to the fact that it's interesting because the idea, because one single utterance can have many combinations, so various constructions can come from one utterance. I myself, I appreciate the color coding of the Casa analysis because I think it's much more pedagogical, and this is the kind of thing that I do, and to visualize it in a more pedagogical way, to me, I hope you, because you're working on something else, so I hope you keep the color coding. I have a question for, you have mentioned that you go at here and there, whether you the definition of construction, right? The constructions that you've come to peace with the fact that constructions are not fixed. There is a kind of, they are dynamic, and you referred to Disa's work, and that across individuals we share some constructions, and that they are more entrenched to certain people in one mind, but less entrenched in others. And my question for you, in terms of entrenchment and the fixation of constructions, the role of frequency, because we are always talking about the token frequency or the type frequency, but to what extent does frequency actually play a role? Just this is the question, but I'm very interested in this because I'm thinking about L2 learning. So just, but I would like to hear your take on this.
Very good question, particularly with the L2 angle. Now, frequency is still incredibly important. We're doing usage-based linguistics, and as we've seen with the color profiles, for example, with the ditransitive, give is such a high-frequent prototype. And I mean, there's also almost a causal link between, if something is used very often, and very often it's going to be the most encompassing, less specific verb. So go is the most sort of unspecific movement. Go can cover, you went somewhere and you went there maybe by car, on foot. So the speed might differ considerably. But because it's such a general verb, you know, it's used very often. And so the prototypes have these categories, or they share the properties of being very broad and at the same time being very frequent. Now, we can also see that these are the constructions that emerge first in first language acquisition, as Adele has shown, and many others, Tomasello, Lieven, Dabrowska, and so on. What we know from the work by Nick Ellis, who's done a lot of constructional work in L2, that for some L2 speakers, it seems as if they use fewer different types, and they always go back to the prototypes. So whereas speakers at one point who got more exposure to many different types, have a higher type frequency, they might use more verbs more frequently. With L2 speakers, sometimes they have like 1 or 2 verbs that they prefer. I mean, particularly early learners, we know this. So they will also use go for intransitive motion. I went there to this place and so on. And they wouldn't use I traveled or I journeyed or, you know, any kind of other verbs that would fit. And also with give that are transitive, you know, they would focus on that and not I presented someone a book. So there is, of course, this difference between L1 speakers having lots of input, which like 24/7, I'm exaggerating a bit, which makes it possible for them to have more item-based constructions in a wider range. And then L2 speakers, depending on how much input they get, you know, and they already got a first language in place, as Alice points out, you know, that's obviously also can be beneficial, but sometimes also perhaps in competition, because you process something and your mind might go to your L1, which you use more often with respect to the constructions. So you can get transfer, you can get positive and negative transfer. So these are important differences when it comes to the output then, which are frequency based. But what I would also sort of like to focus on then beyond that, because as you said, my most recent work is on creativity, and we know that individuals differ greatly as to how creative they are. So some people, you know, will use some very creative constructions or constructs. They will use constructions in a creative fashion. So from it's a clip I got from another talk, Taylor Tomlinson, a US comic. She's talking about how she had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend's mother took her to a restaurant and then said something like, you know, my son is very much like my husband, and, you know, if I could go back in time, I wouldn't know if I would marry my husband again. And then Taylor Tomlinson goes like, wow, she's saving my life here. She Gandalf'd me. Okay. And of course, that brings up Gandalf, and Gandalf is a character from The Lord of the Rings, and many people will know the movie, and there's a specific scene where he stops like a Balrog. But the thing is, we automatically get it and we process this. There's a lot of blending going on, because if you Gandalf someone, right, it's sometimes used online as a bouncer doesn't let you into a club, you know, you shall not pass, okay? Or in this case, it's not the case of the mother stopping her, but the mother sort of protecting her from the Balrog that is her son, sort of exaggerating a bit. So there is selective projection going on, a crucial property of conceptual blending. And also that's why I made the point, we can all process this because we've got the same apparatus. We've got the constructions, we've got symbolic thinking, we've got conceptual blending, and we bring a lot of information to all of this. But some people are more likely to create these things. And what we know from psycholinguistic and psychological studies of creativity is the people who are more creative in their networks, not just language, but in their networks in general, have the property of going further in the network and be getting there faster. So in a spontaneous situation, people who are creative can come up with these things which are beyond coverage, which are beyond frequency, which are beyond what we're used to, because their minds are slightly more active in that sense. It's a matter of gradients, you know, it's not like zeros and one. But the point is, some people can go and say things like she Gandalf'd me, but the beautiful thing about language is that we can process it, we can backtrack, we can get an interpretation. And so frequency is important. A lot of things I say, you know, or if you think about how you manage your day, there's lots of work from corpus linguists saying that 20-30% of what we say are things we said before. So like greetings, if you say I love you to your partner, you know, you will have said this quite often. And some people have certain cliches that they use. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. They say that quite often. So there is lots of constructions that we've got deeply entrenched and that we reuse quite frequently again. But individuals differ as to how far they stray from that. You know, some people might use a lot of these prefabs and be quite happy, and others might use more creative combinations.
Yeah, I like the example of Tomlinson, because I didn't have to come across the verb Gandalfed. He Gandalfed me, she Gandalfed me, in order to understand what she meant. Of course, I needed a prior knowledge on the Lord of the Rings to get the joke. However, I understand there's a sort of template in people's minds to someone ED, right? To understand the idea. And I have a question here from, I was going to comment on something else, but either way, we still go back to the prototype, as you mentioned before. Even though I wasn't aware of the existence of a verb, the Gandalf, to Gandalf someone, I have certain prototypes and certain templates that allowed me to, as an L2 learner, allowed me to understand this statement with the prior knowledge of the story of Lord of the Rings. And there is a question which is kind of related to this prototype mentioning. Ricardo Almada asked, could you talk about the possibility of constructing a sentence with explain, as we do with tell, such as the teacher told me the answer and the teacher explained me the answer? I believe he's referring to Goldberg's work on Telling Me This. And I think it's very much linked to the prototype I was referring to, because we use these templates to communicate.
Yeah. Again, another excellent question, and something that brings up many points. So Adele in 2019 published a book, Explain Me This, and there you got the ditransitive use of explain in the title, and of course she used that because it's normally considered not that acceptable, right? It's considered that people don't say this, they say explain this to me. In earlier works, she used the term preemption and competition. Anatol Stefanovic pointed out that maybe negative evidence plays a role there as well. The point is, in many situations where you have a ditransitive, he gave me the book. You can also have a caused motion variant, he gave the book to me, in which the recipient is in the prepositional phrase. Now, in some Romans, and we can see the historical sort of idiosyncrasy there, verbs in English, like explain, you only get one version. And now a huge question that Adele had been thinking about for quite some time to find a convincing answer is, why don't people overgeneralize? You know, because the construction should be there, and we know that you can use, for example, sneeze, foam off the cappuccino, so you can use an intransitive verb in a caused motion. Why should it be impossible? Or why don't people do this more often? And in the 2019 book, of course, she talks about coverage, which is this item-based notion that verbs that are similar are going to cluster and going to give you what we call the color profile, the item-based versions of a construction. And then for explain, this to me, in English, people will have, and it's idiosyncratic. I mean, erklär mir das. Thomas Herbst just pointed this out the other day. In German, it works with the equivalent verb. So there is no specific cognitive reason why the verb explain should be this particular. So it's to a certain degree a historical idiosyncrasy, but one that sort of gets moved along because of preemption. Because in many situations where, and that brings me to a point where I always thought that should be another talk or something that I should tackle in my research much more, processing, right? Holger mentions it in his book. We know that processing greatly plays a role. So if you've got like two constructions, and the transitive caused motion construction is very well described, normally I gave him the book, but if you have, I gave the book to a very wonderful friend of mine who I used to live with at uni. So if it's a heavy NP, if it's lots of information, lots of words, of course, in terms of processing, it makes sense to put it last, right? In the situations where you have sort of explain this very interesting problem to me, this is something that in the learner, in the first language learner, should trigger something, if we want to put it like that, because normally if you have a very long noun phrase, it should be explain me this very difficult problem. So there's also the processing that should lead to this. And then the preemption bit is sort of people register unconsciously, oh, I'm expecting something else, but it seems to be that with explain only this is possible, sort of summarizing what's going on cognitively, which is of course way more complicated. There is still, however, a very important question, and I think explain me this sometimes can be found. And when we look at the creative part of language, people can do virtually anything, right? You shouldn't be able to break up kick the bucket, but you can kick the proverbial bucket. So you can have a bucket list. So unlike other approaches, we should be very careful to say that something is impossible or it doesn't work at all. And that brings me to another wonderful book, Hans-Jörg Schmid, his entrenchment in conventionalization model is not a constructionist model. He's critical of construction grammar, but many of the assumptions as a cognitive linguistic model are absolutely compatible with what we do. But he points out that, of course, we always got to distinguish individual entrenchment, my constructicon, from the conventionalization in the speech community. Because people in the speech community understand each other, and we already said individuals have slightly different constructicons, but of course they must have got an overlap to understand each other. And the reason they understand each other is that there are conventional constructions that we use in certain situations, and using those is sort of almost a bit also like social glue, but it also ensures efficient communication that we draw on these. And so that's one part. And I think Adele's 2019 book, I think it's a fair statement, focuses on that in particular, you know, and how people use coverage, use frequency, what was said before, to guide them, you know. And even when they come up with something new, it's going to be analogically similar to what you have there. And that is true for a lot of people and a lot of language use. But as I said, my creative work, no, the work is not creative, the work is on creativity. Crucial difference. But it sort of brought to the foreground the fact that, well, it's way more flexible. And I really love the fact I met Remy van Tripp like last week. He was giving a great talk at a workshop where we looked at, where people looked at NLP, natural language processing, computational models, large language models, and construction grammar. And he said that he now also sees constructions, as I said, as something that are more flexible, that can bend, not something that is as fixed. And I think that actually sort of makes, if we incorporate this, construction grammar an even more interesting theory, because a lot of what we have, for historical reasons, is still, for better or worse, influenced by structuralist thinking. So something like schematization is in essence paradigmatic substitution. And the vector space models, obviously, that's distribution, so syntagmatic context. And all of this makes sense. These are important factors. But the question is the mind like a computer that uses these discrete storage elements, that is, uses constructions as phrasal templates that are fixed? Or perhaps, you know, are we more flexible in what we do? Because humans are not computers. And that would also sort of be captured by the fact that when we combine them, as Mark and I say, even in combination, you know, it's not just Lego bricks that we put together. We've got these constructions and pairings that form meaning, and there's conventional ways of putting them together, but we are much more creative as a species, and much more semiotically creative. That's what I mean. So some things might not strike one as very funny or very creative, but they are great ways of bending constructional templates. The example I always use, because I worked a lot on that, is comparative correlatives. The more you eat, the fatter you get. two clauses, protasis, epidosis, cause and effect. They both describe something that's going on over time that either increases or decreases. The more you read, the less you know. So in the literature, in the syntactic literature, these were often described as you need to have two clauses, and three should be impossible, right? Because you only have one cause and one effect. And then you look at the corpus data and you get things like the more you eat, the fatter you get, the sooner you die. And of course, you could break this up into the more you eat, the fatter you get, and the fatter you get, the sooner you die. And the causal chain is still the same. But by blending them into a single chain, you know, you get this coherence and the kind of cause to effect in a much more compact fashion. And again, it's not like fireworks, it's not like the Gandalf example, but it shows the flexibility of constructions. Normally, yeah, we have these two parts, but we can have situations where it's much more apt to put them into this tripart structure.
Thank you for yours. I have many comments about your last answer, but we are short on time. We still have one last question. The question is from Joedson Azevedo. He asks, Professor Hoffmann, considering that your Casa model aims to bridge construction grammar and cognitive pedagogical approaches to syntax, how do you see the potential of constructionist frameworks to describe cross-linguistic parallels, for instance, between English phrasal verbs and fixed verb-particle combinations in Romance languages such as Portuguese or Italian, verbi sintagmatici?
Okay, wow, very cool question. I don't really speak any Romance language well, so I'm not an expert there. But I think construction grammar is actually a great pedagogical tool, also for language learning and for contrast. Interesting enough, later this week in Erlangen, I'll be joining Thomas Herbst, and we invited a couple of people who wanted to look at whether they can use Casa in Spanish, whether they can use Casa for German. So the applicability of the framework for different languages with freer word order, that's always been an issue in construction grammar, which brings us further along the line of dynamicity. But I do think it's got great potential. I think it's also a great tool for language teaching, because language is symbolic and you do use language to express semantic, pragmatic, but also emotional and social meaning, right? And instead of just teaching forms and patterns where students never know what to do with this, you know, out of context, focus on the form, having the meaning as well makes it meaningful to students and makes them, I mean, not like all, some people are just not going to be interested, particularly at school, you know. If you've got a teenager, they're definitely not interested in anything in school. But the point is, on average, you know, having this as meaningful is going to make it more meaningful to people.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was an honor. And I hope you feel better from your cold. You seem to getting out of the cold.
I mean, I'm over it, but it's just on my voice a bit, but it's getting better.
But that was very clear to us. Thank you so much, Thomas. And I hope you can participate in the event. We have a couple of, we're very interested in the L2 acquisition approach. So I guess mixing construction grammar with language acquisition is something that is very interesting for us. And we'll see for the YouTube viewers, we're going to be back at 11:15, às 11:15. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Thomas. Have a nice day.
Thank you once again for having me. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.